So welcome everyone to today's webinar, Saving Nature in the Heat Age, A Natural History of Climate Change, featuring Dr. Mark Urban, whom I will introduce more fully in the moment. My name is Jessie Rack. I'm the program director at the Natural History Institute. I'm located in Prescott, Arizona. I first want to say a couple of words about the Institute for those of you who are not familiar with our work. So the Natural History Institute is a mission-based, independent nonprofit organization based here in Prescott, Arizona. Our mission is to provide leadership and resources for a revitalized practice of natural history that integrates arts, science, and the humanities. And we believe that everyone can participate in the practice of natural history, and that by so doing, they can learn to care for the world and in return reap the mental and physical health benefits of nature. So quickly, I want to bring your attention to a couple of resources the Institute has to offer. One is our website, naturalhistoryinstitute.org. My colleague, Jenny Tutone, is running the tech for this talk. Thanks so much, Jenny. She'll be dropping links in the chat. So if you're interested in looking for those, there's our website. There's all sorts of information on there, including about upcoming programs. Also, we have a YouTube channel where you can find our previous webinars and talks, including the rest of this series, which is our Science in Conversation series. And there were previously 5 other webinars in the series. So along with our webinars, we live stream all of our talks. So even if you're not in the area, you can check them out. Next up, we have a talk by local ornithologist Eric Moore on May 4th. That's all about birding hotspots in the Arizona Central Highlands. And on May 17th, we have a talk by NHI's Director Emeritus, Dr. Tom Fleischner, called Natural History, Reciprocal Healing, and a Sense of Kinship. You can find out all of that stuff on our website. So a couple of quick things about how we're going to work the logistics of the program here today in terms of Zoom protocols. A lot of folks, thanks for everyone who said hi in the chat and told us kind of where you were from. Just so you know, we'll be turning the chat off momentarily because we find it can be a little distracting to the panelists. So that'll be off, but in its place, we'll be using the Q&A function, which is also at the bottom of the screen on the right there. You'll see a little icon that's like cartoon speech bubbles. And this will be on throughout the whole program. So if at any time you have a question for Mark or a comment you'd like to make, we'll visit those in the last few minutes of this program. Also, if you see someone has asked a question or made a comment that's kind of what you were going to say, you can use, there's a little thumbs up icon, so you can thumbs it up, and it shows us a lot of people are really trying to ask the same thing. Finally, this program also will be recorded and available on the YouTube channel. You'll get an email tomorrow, whether you're here or not, just saying, you know, here's the link, and feel free to share if you're so inspired. A final note, today's webinar is co-sponsored by the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance, who seek to raise awareness of the threats of climate change and to mobilize residents to organize and work towards solutions that reduce human impact on climate. If you're in the area, you can visit their website, which we just put in the chat, to learn more and get involved. So with that, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our guest here today, Dr. Mark Urban. A few things about Mark. He's an award-winning scientist, the Arden Chair and Professor of Ecology, the Arden Chair, and Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Connecticut. He's a global expert on climate change impacts on nature and evolutionary ecology. So he's an avid field biologist who spends time in ponds, lakes, and streams in regions ranging from New England to the North Slope of Alaska. He founded and directs the Center of Biological Risk, which is the first center devoted to forecasting the complex risks to society mediated by ecosystems. He's authored over 80 scientific articles appearing in journals such as Science, Nature Climate Change, Proceedings of the National Academy, and has been cited more than 11,000 times. His work on climate change impacts on species extinctions were highlighted as one of the top scientific discoveries of 2015 by Discover magazine, and in the Royal Society's update to the 5th IPCC report. And his research has been covered by news outlets around the world. Since 2015, he's led an annual contingent of UConn students, faculty, and staff to the United Nations Summits on Climate Change. And despite all of these accolades, Mark is probably most famous for also being my PhD advisor. So thank you so much, Mark, for being with us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Jesse. And I figured that, part of this is just to turn the tables on me and, ask me the hard questions now.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. Yeah, I remember all the questions since we chatted last time. No, I'm just kidding. So, so kind of to bookend this conversation, I'm from the Natural History Institute, and I'm kind of framing this. We named this, Saving Nature in the Heat Age and Natural History of Climate Change. Let's talk about natural history. So, how do you define natural history, and where do you see it in your work? And maybe just to kind of sorry, maybe just to kind of give you our definition, our institutional definition, we define it as a practice of focused attention receptivity to the more than human world, guided by honesty and accuracy. And the important part there is that we like to think of it as a practice. And I know that's a little different than how science sometimes use it. So I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, thanks. So for me, natural history is all about observing the world, and the focus is on trying to understand it. And so, as a scientist, that's our job, is we're trying to understand the world and figure out how it works. And so, in terms of how that interacts with the science I do, science can be a bit different in terms of we're really trying to prove and really disprove these ideas about how the world works. And that often involves manipulating the world and doing things like experiments, and then coming up with general ideas. And so we can call them theories. Yeah, that's different than the natural history practice, as you call it, because that's really confined to this observation. But I do think that they're not mutually exclusive. They're two parts that feed into each other.
Yeah, I agree. That makes a lot of sense too. That's sort of when I used to do environmental education with younger children, I'd often start teaching the scientific method by having them just do natural history, just practice observing and asking questions about the thing. What are you noticing? What are you wondering? So I think that's like kind of the same way you're saying, like building up to.
Yeah, I think that's, I think that's at least how my career has proceeded in terms of, I'm outside and I'm trying to wrangle some frogs for an experiment or something like that, and I see something, and I start to collect those observations, those natural history observations, and it sort of sits somewhere in the back of my brain, and then eventually they start to come together, and there's a pattern, a picture that forms, and I start to think, oh well, maybe this is the way things are working. And then from there I would use those natural history observations to come up with something, maybe something that's a little bit more applicable to more species than just what I'm working on. And maybe there's an experiment in there, then I'll test to see if that's really true or not.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I love how you use both aspects. And that you're very kind of aware of how natural history is at work in your work. So let's find out more about that, because I'd love to hear kind of how you got to where you are. So can you describe a bit for us of your personal pathway of wherever you started to wrangling frogs and becoming an ecologist, and just maybe the process of, if it's not too much to say, like kind of falling in love with the world and wanting to ask these questions.
Yeah, for me, I was one of those kids that was outdoors, and I was picking up every log to see what was under it, and every rock in the stream, and I really was just curious about what was going on outside, and it was my playground. So I was, there that was what I did, and it very quickly it turned into something that was a type of science, I guess I would call it. That I made all sorts of natural history collections. So I had insects that were pinned, and I had fossils and rocks, and all sorts of acorns and things like that were all just sitting on my shelves. And I even had a little space in the basement that my parents made me so I could do my science experiments, and I'd make observations on birds. I remember I had a bird feeder, and I'd watch them like before a snowstorm, and then I'd watch them during the snowstorm, and I'd write in a little journal.
Oh my
Like
God.
what,
How
what
old
the
were
behaviors
you?
were. I don't know. It was probably like 10 or something like that. I wish I could find the journal, because there might be some really good research in there.
Yeah, I can still use that.
Yeah, but yeah, I was really a scientist from very early on, and yeah, just continue to be excited about trying to figure out how the world works.
Yeah. Yeah. I realized in your whole bio, I didn't even say where you went to school. Where did you go to undergrad? I know you did your master's and PhD at Yale. Yeah.
Yeah, so I grew up in Pennsylvania,
Mhm.
right along the Appalachian Trail, and so there was a lot of nice wilderness around me. And then from there, I went to Muhlenberg College, which is a college in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and studied environmental science and political science. And then I went to the Yale. It's called the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies back then. Now it's the environmental school, but uh, there I did a master's at first, and then a PhD.
That's the Wrangling frogs. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was like as a child, I was wrangling frogs and salamanders.
Yeah.
In undergrad, though, I had a really great mentor, Dr. Bratt, who took me into her lab, and she really taught me how to work on stream insects. And so I really loved, these stream insects that we would collect and identify. And she didn't drink coffee, but she knew I did, so she even bought a coffee maker. So I'd stay in the lab and do my work identifying the insects. And so I thought when I would go to grad school, I would study these stream insects. And
Yeah.
my advisor was open to it. He, was open to any research, but as part of my financial package, I worked for him, and he worked on amphibians and said, well, I need you to go out and sample, 80 ponds for amphibians. And so I started doing that, and really enjoyed it. I think that the amphibian system is just really great for learning about how ecology works, because you have a lot of ponds. So just in like one forest, you might be able to go and look at 20, 30, 40 ponds, and the diversity is not too great, but it's also not too little. And so there's a good amount of diversity to work with. And the frogs and salamanders are just so cool. I mean, they're just amazing creatures, and just hard to not want to work on them, I guess.
No argument here. That's also what I think. Well, thank you so much for kind of walking us through that. And so, having incorporated all of these various elements and had all these experiences, could you give us kind of a blurb of what is your research today focus on? Because I know it kind of incorporates a lot of different spheres of knowledge now.
Yeah, I think as someone who gets excited by a lot of things, my research is pretty broad. But when I'm made to say what I do, I would say I'm generally a community ecologist, which is someone who works on understanding biodiversity. What determines it? How is it changing? And in terms of that, like I said earlier, the one thing that has determined the path of my career is what I see in nature, is the natural history that I've looked at. And in working on these systems, whether it's the invertebrates, the stream insects, or the frogs and salamanders, I've seen things that then have pushed my career in certain directions. And so some of those is I've seen that they adapt to the local conditions. So that sent me into an area of thinking about evolution and how it affects ecology. And I've seen the effects of climate change. And so as I witnessed those changes in the natural world, that has pushed my career in the direction of more applied work and understanding how climate change affects diversity.
Well, that's helpful. And I know you kind of started out, and you started to tell us a little bit about this too, about why amphibians are such a useful focal group, I guess, and why they're so interesting to you. I guess I've seen you in your work, I've seen it kind of go from like focused behavioral and local adaptation scale stuff to these more big picture questions of extinction risk of species. So how did amphibians kind of lead you there? Like, what's so special about amphibians that kind of, and you maybe answered this a little bit, what do you notice with them with climate change impacts? What's leading you to the big picture questions, I guess? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, so in terms of amphibians, what made me start to research climate change was the fact that here in Connecticut, we have, there's a predaceous species called marbled salamanders, and it turns out that they're restricted in where they can live in ponds if there's too much ice cover. And so whether it's a severe winter or if the pond gets really cold, they can't survive because they need to overwinter in those ponds. And so what I witnessed was, as I was doing my work as a graduate student in Connecticut, was that a lot of the ponds didn't have this predator. And then in the academic career, you end up going off and sometimes doing a postdoc. So it's kind of in between grad student and a professor. And I did that, and I went away from my field site, away from those natural history observations, and went to California and had a wonderful time there for 2 years. Saw there were some folks in California. It's a wonderful place. When I came back for my job, when I came back, I mean, almost every pond had these marbled salamanders. And because they're a top predator, they're sort of like a wolf in those ponds. The ponds were really strongly altered. And so it really sort of drove home to me the idea that climate change was having an effect on ecosystems, not just faraway places. They were having an effect on the very ponds that I studied. And the other part about it was it really happened so quickly. It was just me being gone for 2 years, and suddenly these ponds were so very different by this change. And it happened because the winters had warmed quite a bit. We saw this expansion. We see that to this day. And so observing those effects of climate change have really brought to my mind that it's really an important subject. And then from there, the jump to understanding it more globally was trying to understand not just how climate change affects my set of species, but how does it affect all species, and can we come to some sort of broader understanding, with the hope that broader understanding will help us to know how to protect those species. Because ultimately, whether you are someone who studies those species and tries to find fundamental truths, or just enjoys those species, we want to keep them around through this period of what I've called the heat age. And eventually we'll get to a point where we'll come to our senses, we'll fix this problem, and we'll come back to a normal Earth. And hopefully we can keep as much as we can in terms of species in the meantime. But that's going to take some hard work. It's going to take a lot of work to protect those species through this heat age.
Yeah. Thanks for explaining that. I like how just like your deep knowledge of what was going on in these little ponds in New England just really kind of sparked this, because it was such a microcosm for watching things change. Just like a small scale little window. So.
A small pond.
Little small pond, yeah. No, but it's so great that was what allowed you to kind of see what was happening in a very tangible way, so that later you could kind of think more about the bigger stuff. And so let's talk more about that, because I know you started to mention this, that your more recent work is this large scale, asking big questions about extinction risk of lots of species. Just big picture, where does your data come from? How do you think about this stuff? How do you ask your questions?
Yeah, I was trying to write a paper about my system and talk about climate change and extinction risk. And if you've ever read a scientific paper, there's this first paragraph where you try to frame the issue and talk about what other people have found. And so I was there trying to write that paragraph, and I wanted to say something about the overall risk to species worldwide from climate change, and then get into the nitty-gritty of what I was studying. And then I went to go look at the literature and couldn't find anything that really did that in a satisfying way. Some of the studies suggested 1% of species were at risk, but was really focused on, say, birds or mammals. Another one was focused on a certain environment, maybe mountain environments or island environments. And so, I didn't necessarily decide to do it. It was sort of I needed this open and piece of information, and then realized there was a big gap, and that somebody needed to fill it. And so I decided I would do that. And what that did, and in terms of the data that it required, it was to assemble all the data out there. And so basically became an exercise in gathering studies of everyone who has looked at extinction risk from climate change. And then you kind of smash them all together in a statistically correct manner, and you can come up with, real general insights about those risks. And so it's called a meta-analysis. So it's going beyond a single analysis and trying to understand overall effects.
Cool. Like analysis of all of the previous analyses, kind of like that's
Right,
just
yeah.
bigger. Yeah. So you're just collecting them all. That's fascinating. So, and also sounds like so much work to have to collect all of the data that was in existence about this. So that's a big deal. That's great. Sorry, did you have?
No, I was gonna say, yeah, no, it was one of those things that every day I would kind of wake up and read a few papers and add them to the study, and then just keep doing that for months and months and months.
Yeah, just slow cumulative work. Dang.
So not as fun as being in the
wrangling.
field and doing natural history. Natural history would have been more fun.
Yeah. I just can't get away from the word wrangling frogs. I love it. So how, I guess maybe this is for you. How do people predict things like extinction risk? How do you start by modeling it, and then how do you predict the large scale stuff? How does that work?
Yeah, so we're building predictive models, just like lots of people build. So we have weather forecasters or people that are trying to predict elections or sporting events. So you start with some sort of concept of the way that you think the world works, and put that into some sort of model. And when I say model, it can mean lots of things. It can be expert opinion is a type of model, conceptual model. It can be something that's very mathematical, and we might run on a computer for days or weeks, or it could be something relatively simple where we look at some correlations between the current climate and where species are, and then draw some conclusions about what's affecting those distributions. And then it becomes predictive in terms of, so we try to make a good model that describes the current situation. And then what we do, if it was climate change we're working on, we would add, the future climate into that model, and then see what you get out. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. For the most part, people have done through that middle approach of finding some correlations. You take that species distribution, species range. If people are familiar with the back of your bird guide, you can look up and see if that bird you thought you saw is actually in your area. So it's got those blobs of color on the map. So you take that range, and then you put the climate in there and project that to the future. So that's what most of those models are. But increasingly we're interested in making better models that aren't just about statistics and are about the biology of the species.
Got it. So essentially, if I can kind of summarize this, just say it another way, I guess. So predictive model, like you mean like a mathematical model where you're using math and computer programs, right? To kind of, yeah.
Sometimes, like I said, I would say a model is also a conceptual model. And so it could be, there's also models out there where you get a bunch of experts, people who know the species, and say, I think the risk of extinction is this much. So it's a whole range.
Oh, I didn't know you could just say a model out loud and it would be.
Yeah, a model is just, it's a way the world works, and you're making clear your assumptions, right? So I think that's the thing that distinguishes it from just, say, someone who's making a comment somewhere.
Got it.
It's just having those, what do you mean by this? What are you assuming here? And then, then you can understand where the prediction comes from.
So it's like a logic and evidence-based prediction of
I think that's
of what's going to happen. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Cool. And so with respect to extinction rate and climate stuff, you're putting in information that you know about, like temperature and weather and whatever else, rainfall, and up against where they currently are in their range and how you think those places might change. Is that?
Yeah, that's the simple approach is doing that. And then, you can imagine if temperature rises, 3 degrees, then you
Mhm.
add that on and see how the range would change, right? Does
Okay.
it shrink? Does it expand? Does it move?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah.
But, I think the big but there is I don't think those models are the greatest. I think that's the easiest to do, and that's what we can do for the most species. And we may not have the data to do better models, but when we do, I think we want to add in biology, and that's where natural history comes in. That's where we want to take that understanding of the natural world and use that to inform the models. So just to give an example, you can imagine doing this for a plant species, and you put in your climate variables and you say it should occur there. And yet that this plant never occurs on, say, a certain kind of soil type.
Mhm.
Right? So if you're a gardener, that, okay, you could plant this plant in your yard, but it's not going to survive because you don't have the right soil. So you have to
Mhm.
amend the soil somehow. So that's the type of thing that, okay, well, this is something we know about that species. So it makes sense that we put it in our model because we want to be as right as we can be.
Mm. So I would love to know more about kind of this idea of like, that was a great example and that's very helpful, but how can natural history information like overall, like what kinds of information could be gathered from natural history to make better predictions and better models?
Yeah. So I'll just take a little bit of a step back and say that
Yeah.
I appreciate natural history in all forms, and we can learn so much from natural history. Uh, just in general, just to know about the world, but also to help humans, right? So there's examples of people that you've interviewed who have seen something in nature and they can turn it into something that's very useful, and nature is full of those ideas, things that we couldn't even dream up. The nature has solved all these problems that have been thrown at them for millions of years. So all of that is great and important. What I see though is that we're going to be losing species potentially, right? So there's estimates that 1 million species could be at risk of extinction from climate change and also other changes that are happening. And so in my mind, we need to do natural history that can help save those species. And so information that's useful for those predictive models. And the reason why I focus so much on prediction is that, if we had unlimited time and resources, we would, could save all species, right? Maybe. But we don't, right? We know that's not true in any world. So we really are confined to saving those species that are most at risk. And so we want to know what those species are. And I would say right now, we don't really know which species are most at risk. We have some ideas here and there, but there's lots of species that seem like they're doing fine and maybe at grave risk in the future, and others that we may think are threatened and will do just fine. And so it's those pieces of natural history information that can help us divide up the world into those species that are at risk and are not, which would be really important. So these are things about the way in which species live in different environments. So how are they affected by environmental variation? How many babies do they have? When do they breed? When do they flower? Things about how far they disperse. So one of the important parts of climate change research is that many of the habitats that species live in now are not disappearing. They're just moving. They're just moving here in the north. They're moving toward the North Pole, or they're moving up a mountain. So how far does something disperse, and can it keep up? I'm really interested in the species interactions, how they're moderated by climate. And so another thing that natural history really is important for is understanding, which species are interacting. What does a species eat? What are some mutualists of that species? So information like that is really critical for putting in these models, improving those models from what they are now, and given us a much better idea of what species we need to devote those limited conservation dollars to save.
Yeah. Don't we already know a lot of that stuff, or not really?
Yeah, I'd say we don't. I'd say that we have some indications. I think we've got some, broad ideas, but it's interesting because when you look at some species, they might seem okay, but then when you really get to understand them, you understand that there's, say some threshold point at which they're doing fine now, but suddenly they reach this threshold and they can't survive.
Yeah.
So I'd say that we don't know a lot about which species, and we don't know a lot of that information for species. So I think that's the other point to make. I think naively, I often go into a new system thinking, oh, we must know a lot about this frog, right? And because it's been studied for years. And then I say, oh, well, I need to know this piece of information. And I find out, no, we don't know that yet, right? So we did an exercise at one point, a big group of scientists, and we wanted to pick the species that we thought had the most information that we could put into a model predicting how they'll survive with climate change. And so we picked 4 species and then went about the business of collecting that information about how their populations grow and environmental effects and dispersal and even in things like adaptability. And it was sobering in the end because these 4 species we thought were the best in the world for having the data we needed. There were big gaps. So none of them had all the information, and there were 2 species that had had more information, at least than the others, and they were species that were economically important. So there'd been a lot of studies in that regard. So timber trees and fish that are commercially harvested.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what are the 4 species? I'm curious.
Oh, it was a Pacific salmon and a European beach. Yeah.
Okay. And the other 2?
So there was a fence lizard and a butterfly in the UK.
Oh, I would have thought the fence lizard would be. Okay.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Fence lizard have big gaps. Yeah. So we think about, that, oh, we must know all this knowledge of, species around the world.
Yeah.
And when you really get down to it, there's still gaps, and so we need to fill those gaps quickly, and then also in a way that helps us to save those species.
Yeah. And so one challenge I see, like from the science side of getting the studies to do that kind of stuff, right, is the lack of funding, or the struggle for funding for basic biology, right? Which is kind of what this is. It's like, we need that, but it's an indirect reason. Is that something you've encountered? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of, at least the, government scientific money is going toward scientific research that's less about collecting that information and more about doing a very certain kind of experiment or coming to figure out an answer to a certain problem. In terms of just collecting pure natural history, I don't think that there's a lot of support for that financially. So it tends to happen as sort of a side project of these other scientific projects, and so we're always collecting natural history, but we're not getting funded directly to collect that natural history. So I don't know quite how to solve that problem. I would imagine that if there was some coordination of the types of species we want to work on and the types of information we need, then we might be able to figure out a way to fund that. The other part about that is there is all sorts of natural history information out there, but it's often not accessible, so it may be hard to find. It may never have been published. It may be in someone's notebook. So I think another thing that we could do is we could push people to, like, whatever information you have, you've already collected it. Let's find a way to get it out there and organize it in a way that's easily accessible. So there are some attempts at that in terms of putting together databases of traits and things like that, but I don't think there's like a one-stop place yet. And I think that would be a great way to advance our understanding.
Yeah, and I think Two, well, first of all, I think it's time for you to dig out your 10-year-old notebooks of bird watching. And
That's longer than 10 years.
and I think that might be a really great place to kind of get the public involved, right? And to kind of get, and I mean, you probably already know this, but to get like action from everyone, not just scientists who are struggling for funding to do these types of projects, but the folks that are out there every day, just like learning by doing natural history naturally, that's by doing natural history already. And they know so much, but maybe they aren't at a university and they aren't publishing in the way the academy like approves of. But yeah, have you had any kind of involvement in this like community science / citizen science work, or how might that fit in?
I think it's a great approach. We're finding that really great data can be collected, and there's enthusiasm across communities to collect this data. And essentially you just need some sort of way in which it's easy for folks that go out on the weekend to collect that data and get it to these websites or whatever to collate it. So things like iNaturalist have been really useful, and scientists are using those data points to understand where species are and perhaps where they're moving with climate change. And so that's been a really great place to find that information. One of the things we did a while back, we've been doing it now every year, is we created this Amphibian Tracker because we were basically trying to figure out when we had to go out and sample our ponds. And we know that the amphibians start to migrate earlier in the southern part of the United States. And then as the weather warms up, they start to migrate farther and farther north. And then when they get to, say New Jersey or Pennsylvania, we know we got to get ready for our season in Connecticut. So yeah, we were able to find all these reports from all over the country and put it onto a map and color code them and be able to use that. And not just for us, but then people, for example, who are trying to come up with a brigade to save frogs or salamanders that are crossing the road in their town. They'll know when to get ready, and we hope to use it to get a broader understanding of the timing of amphibian migrations with weather patterns.
And you have like several years worth of data with that, right? Because you started that when I was a grad student.
Yeah, multiple years. Yeah. How long ago was that? What was that?
Oh my gosh, my defense anniversary is tomorrow. So,
really?
Sorry, everyone. So 6 years, 7 years, something like that.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Right. It's been that long. Yeah.
7 years. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, again, I think you had already started it in like 2015 or 14, maybe 14, I want to say.
Something like that. Yeah.
Something around there. Yeah. And I apologize. I didn't have the link. I should have thought to have it queued up to drop in the chat. But if anyone watching is interested, you can just email me and I'll shoot it to you. It's a great, you can Google Amphibian Tracker, probably Yukon, like University of Connecticut, not Yukon Territory. That will not get you there. That's great. Thanks, Mark. And it's good that exists. I've done a lot of work with these community science efforts as well. When I was in Tucson, we were doing a lot with the National Phenology Network. Phenology is just the timing of life events of plants and animals. So you can even get kids involved, like when do the leaves show up on the trees? Like when are the birds coming in? Like when are things happening? So and that's a national, that's also like you can get on the website and get all this national data for how early blooms are happening, how early leaf out is happening in different regions.
Yeah, it's a great way to get out there and engage in natural history, and also you could have a positive effect, and eventually you could see how that data is used to make broader generalizations about what's happening, say when flowers bloom, or even help affect the way conservation is done. Yeah.
There's a really interesting anecdote. No, it's a real, I think there was a publication on it. So a real interesting story of kind of phenological mismatch that's happening in Arizona that I don't know if you're aware of. It's like a pretty iconic one because the saguaros and the white-winged doves. Do you know this one?
No.
Yeah, this is one that people in Arizona talk about a lot. So basically, the white-winged doves time their migration to come up when the saguaros are blooming, and so they act as pollinators, and they also will
Mm,
like eat the fruits and feed their young with it, and then they distribute the seeds by pooping them out. Um, Except now the timing of the bloom is off, and so they're arriving and not having the right amount of food, or timing to feed their young, and it's maybe a little more visible here because the saguaro is like our iconic
right.
plant.
Yeah.
I was actually in Tucson in October and there were saguaros blooming because it had been so weirdly cool,
Yeah.
and they were like, "Is it May? Is it May?" And it freaked me out, but um,
Yeah. Yeah. I think the interaction of species is really interesting, as you suggested, because if you're just going to do those basic models where you just overlaid climate on the maps
mhm,
of ranges, you'd miss out on this really cool interaction,
yeah,
and an interaction that could change really quickly and affect the survival of those species.
yeah,
And so we find that oftentimes climate change is not a direct impact. Say, it's too hot for you. It's
yeah,
actually mediated by other species, and so you lose your food source, or you lose your pollinator, or there's a new disease that comes along.
yeah,
And so changing just a small amount of climate, it affects these species in all different ways, and you're likely to affect a few of those kind of dramatically because of some sort of threshold that they have, and then how they interact with all the other species can create this cascade of effects. And so
yeah.
being able to explain those is difficult, but again, it comes down to watching nature, seeing who's interacting with whom and all that.
Mm. I think that's the benefit of both. Well, I guess both the practice of natural history, but also like grounding in ecology. So kind of the two sides, because you're not just isolating an individual species and asking questions about it without anything. You're remembering that it's part of all the things. And when you're practicing natural history, you can't help but see that. And coming with the background of ecology means you like have to consider it. So
Right.
kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think that's the way that natural history is really important in science,
Mhm.
is to not forget what's really happening in the real world. Because let's face it, you could be a scientist and you're in your office, and you're teaching classes, so you don't get out in the field.
Mhm.
You could lose sight of it, and you could say, okay, yeah, I'm going to make this model, and it's going to be about this species, um, and you find out that it doesn't work at all, because if you're out there in the field and you're watching, you say, oh wow, I can't do this. I can't think of this species without thinking about these other species, and it's
Yeah.
all this whole thing. Um, yeah, I think that those um, observations is what should underlie the science.
Yeah.
It's not, science also has these other kind of strict rules, and trying to figure out what's truth from just some useless correlation or whatever. But but it's got to be grounded in the real world. It's got to be grounded in how things really work.
So how do we solve this? How do we get all of the naturalists out there and all the, government employees and biologists and science, like university scientists? How do we all share information? What do we do? What's the answer? Do we just build a big web page? Do we make our own? Yeah, how do we get all this information in one place? I feel like it's just it maybe exists, but maybe like you said, it's in lots of people's notebooks and in
Yeah.
their journals and in their side projects. How do we get it out there? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that there's a role for these databases where it's easy enough to put your data in, and
Yeah.
I think that there can be sort of some carrots for inducing people to put their data into them, whether it's through funding agencies, or requirements for working on projects in a park or something like that. So yeah, I think that it could be some little carrots, or to get people to put that data in there. Um, yeah, I also think that one of the things we could do is if there's a focus on this, then if we just get everybody who has an understanding of a particular species or system to sort of put together that information and contact other people, then maybe we can make some progress, right? So I feel like for me, it's really hard to think about global biodiversity. It's like, okay, well, boy, that's really hard. But I can think about, the salamanders and frogs that I wrangle. I'm just gonna say that word a lot now.
Now you're wrangling salamanders too.
Oh yeah, they're the ones. They're the hardest to wrangle. So yeah, I can think about that, and I can think about, well, I know, a lot of the information about, these species, and so maybe we get sort of everybody to sort of work on their knowledge set, and then there's ones that maybe nobody works on and nobody knows much about, and then we can sort of coordinate efforts. Maybe you do a couple species, and then a couple, you work on that you don't know. So yeah, I mean, if you look across the world, there's people who are scientists and non-scientists that are working to understand these species, and so yeah, maybe there's some sort of coordination to say, like, okay, you're in charge of collecting all the information for the species.
Yeah.
I mean, there's only like 8 billion species, right? And or not 8 billion, there's 8 million species, and then there's 8 billion people, right? So
it's easy.
More than enough.
Just assign them.
Right.
It's great.
Homework.
So let us know in the Q&A which animal species you choose.
Yeah, that's a good one.
But also a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A. I'll turn to that here in like a couple more minutes, and we'll get Mark to answer whatever questions you have. So I guess your recommendation then is, for non-academic and non-technical scientist folks, to just like use these platforms, use these community science and like data sharing platforms as much as possible, and just get it out in the world. Is that a good?
Yeah, there's ones that have to do with observing species, and then there are individual projects that are looking to collect other data, like you said. Phenology network is a good one. And so yeah, look, maybe you could put together a list of some of those, and folks can go out and put whatever data they have, or collect new data.
Yeah, that's great.
We're all naturalists.
We are, definitely. We can all be scientists too, just maybe not at a university, but I mean, doing the science, I think, is something that I think everyone can do. Everyone can ask questions and answer them in the same way that everyone can make observations and learn. So yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, well, I have one more kind of formal question for you, and then we can turn it over to the Q&A. So just to kind of bookend this with the natural history idea, I know kind of in my experience, or I don't know, traditionally natural history is sometimes looked down on by science. So it's just kind of thought of as too simplistic, or too much just observational and not enough manipulation. Can you speak to that? Is that realistic? I mean, obviously everything you're saying is that it's useful, but would you like to address the
yeah, I guess I would push back a little bit. I think that I think most, I guess, biologists that I hang out with would say that natural history is really important, right? It's important for informing our studies. It's important for helping us do our research. I think we all think natural history is important. No, there's another side of science that is much more about experiments and lab work and statistics and all that. But the natural history underlies all that, and it underlies the really good ideas, I think, that are out there. It's you see something, and suddenly it's a new way of thinking about the world. Now, it's not to say that we should do all natural history. I think it is an important part that scientists play in trying to remove the biases of those observations, and kind of get right to the process that's affecting a pattern. But yeah, I don't think it's looked down upon. I think if you were a scientist who only, say, published on natural history observations, like, I think that would be sort of problematic in some sectors, and you never tried to sort of move that into the direction of testing those ideas.
Like experimental manipulation.
I think most people do, a lot of natural history. It may not be as obvious because it's sort of getting incorporated into these bigger projects. But.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I guess this is stemming from, I just remember being in grad school and folks would be like, oh, I don't need to read this. Like, it's just natural history. Like, it's just a natural history paper. There's no experiment at all. And it just strikes me as just like something that some like pretentious, like, ivory tower folks are like, oh, natural history. I've seen it referred to as the unfashionable science and like a public science thing. So in the last few years. So I think I'm just thinking of it in that, like, it's unfashionable, but why?
Right. Yeah, I think maybe there are some folks that believe that, but not that many. I think it's a minority. I think we all think it's really useful.
Yeah.
And I think it is. I think it is coming back. I think that you're starting to see more and more people talk about being naturalists, and I think maybe you just sort of saw this shift, and now we're coming back to reality that natural history is important for science. It can't be done without it.
Yeah. And maybe part of it is just like a misunderstanding. Like the word is complicated. The terminology is sometimes like not the easiest to understand. So
yeah, I think a lot of people don't quite know what exactly it means sometimes.
we should rebrand. What should we call it?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's hard. It's yeah. I mean, I think it's the history part that people have trouble with.
It's the history part. People think history means people and wars.
Right. Or it's like, long-term patterns in nature. It's just got to call it nature wrangling.
That's me from the Nature Wrangling Institute. Good one. Before we turn to questions, Mark, is there anything that you wanted to say that I forgot to ask that you'd like to kind of put a bow on? Anything?
Yeah, I would just sort of reiterate the idea in terms of natural history and climate change. And so, for me, I like to use the analogy in classes that species are these amazing books of knowledge, and natural history is basically reading those books and understanding them, and there's a lot of benefits to doing that. As we see the climate change advance and all these other changes to nature, and we threaten maybe even 1 million species, we're losing those books pretty rapidly. And so I think in the near term, we need to get the information from those books to save the species so we have a chance to read them later on, and we want to keep them on our bookshelf. Even if we're not going to read them today, we want to be able to read them in the future. And so we may have to sort of pick and choose a few of those chapters to read to keep them on the bookshelf. But yeah, I think that's the grand challenge is keep all those books, and then it'll be fascinating to continue to learn from them.
Yeah, when we're old, we can curl up by the fire and read about amphibians.
That's right.
Well, thank you, Mark. Let me turn to, we have a couple of questions. If anyone else has questions, get them in now. So the first one is from Usha, who says, I have been hearing about the cold weather and greening of Arizona, but part of the challenge with the climate change issue is that weather changes are not consistent in one direction. It's more of a fluctuation. So Arizona may have another normal or hot year. So her question is, are species interactions such as cactus flowering and birds coming to feed, et cetera, are those adaptable to climate change that's not linear, that's more of a fluctuation? For example, would birds come back next year in May, winter if Arizona weather gets back to normal for a year? Like, is there a normal anymore? Can we go back to it? I paraphrase that, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, eventually we'll go back to normal, but not right away. Yeah. So there, one of the things with understanding weather is it's highly variable, as the question suggests, and climate change, of course, is the long-term averages. So it's not the waves in the ocean, but how the sea rises over a long period of time. The fluctuations are difficult for species to deal with. So, I mean, some are better or worse. And so Jesse's thesis was about how organisms can change according to how the environment is changing, and so there's a decent amount of that. But yeah, so if as things get really variable, that is one of the things that we see can really influence how species can survive. And there's been some indications in some places that variability may be increasing Other places it may be decreasing, and it depends on sort of the time frame and what climate variability you're looking at. But there's been a lot of interest in trying to put into our predictions more about the variability than just sort of the mean changes. And when we do that, we do see that you can see different effects because organisms are sensitive to those highly variable climate variables.
Mm-hmm. And I think in terms of like, if I can jump into the phenological mismatch thing where, for example, two species are tightly tied in their timing of their life cycle, like the bird's coming back and requires a certain food to be there. There's, I guess a little margin of error where maybe a few are blooming and so a few survive, but I could see that acting kind of like as a force of natural selection, right? To be like, some of them survived and there's fewer now, but maybe next year it's back to normal, but there aren't as many. Does that sound right?
Yeah. Like I said, I think some organisms can do quite well because they're really, they're going to change according to those weather events, whereas others say for example, if there's a species that breeds when there's X hours of daylight, they're not going to be flexible at all, right? They're just going to come and it's going to be the wrong weather pattern.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, we have a couple more. Here's one from Kylie who says, from your perspective, how does long-term data for specific systems, species, or just in general fit into predictive models? How much importance should we place on long-term data versus other data that's incorporated?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, boy, long-term data is like the best. Whenever we can find it, it's so useful in understanding how things are changing. In terms of the modeling part, what we can use that long-term data for is to correct our models and choose the best models. So if you're just working with some data as a snapshot in time, you build the model and you can't see if it works very well because you're sort of just building it on this data set. What you really need is data that's different in space or time to say, okay, well, if we move this to this other place or time period, does it still work? And oftentimes when we do that, we find it works not very well. So people talk about the failure of extrapolating. So that's really problematic. So if you do have long-term data, then you can build a model, say, for the current period, and then do something we'd call hindcasting, to make a prediction for prior time periods and see if it works or not. And you're really trying to get at the core of the processes that really determine those natural dynamics, rather than just sort of correlated factors that don't actually mean anything. And that the climate scientists figured this out a long time ago, and that was the impetus toward standardizing and collecting weather at these stations around the world. And then when they went to go build these weather or climate prediction models, they had these long time frames of data, and they could build them and validate them and continue to improve them till they could do a really good job of predicting not just now, but or describing what's happening now, but also predicting what happened in the past.
Great, thank you. We have one more question from Gabriel, who asks, this is a good one. Are there examples of ecologists collaborating with local master naturalist chapters and trying to properly catalog the incredible amount of data that the members possess, and/or collaborating with environmental historians who often have done the work of poring through the archives of monks, sailors, and other people who in the past had excellent records of phenology, climate, past disturbances? Do you have examples?
Yeah, I think that we're seeing a real change in the science in terms of recognizing the importance of all this data that's out there that may not be in a stuffy journal article, but is just as good, if not better, and could inform over larger timescales, for example. And so I think, you're seeing a lot more scientists who are putting in their grants that they're going to work with community members to get that data, work with indigenous people to understand what understanding they have. And I have seen more and more work that looks into history to gain information on these types of events. For example, Jesse's talked about phenology of plants and flowering, and there's a colleague who looked at Thoreau's journals and was able to look at how the flowers were blooming back in a long time ago when he was out in Walden Pond, and went back in today and looked at those flowering times and showed that they were much earlier. So that we need all that information, and so I think that you're seeing a change in how we approach that and trying to get it all together. We're all on one team, and we're just trying to understand the world and protect it.
Good one. I was going to mention the Thoreau example if you didn't. That's what I always think of, was the how he was so meticulous in his journals that he recorded, oh, I just saw the first whatever blooming. And so it was really easy. Well, not easy, but it was possible to go back through and compare those timings, which is really cool. Okay, one final question that I think is a good one to end on, because let's get your take. Are you pessimistic about the effect of climate change on the biosphere?
Yeah, it can be a bit of a depressing subject in terms of, essentially cataloging which species might go extinct. So I admit some days it's hard to get out of bed, but I think it's really important work. And I think that the thing is that just because we predict those species could go extinct doesn't mean that they will go extinct. And that's where it just takes us to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And so if we know a species is endangered because of climate change, then we just got to figure out a way to protect it. And, once we have a job to do, I think that's, more optimistic, and yeah, we just got to figure out how to save the species and get together, organize and do it. So in that respect, we can be optimists.
Yeah. Doing something is better than doing nothing. And right. So whatever we can do is something. So fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you to Mark for taking the time to chat with me. I really appreciate all of you taking the time in the middle of your day or the latter part of the afternoon, wherever you are. This webinar is being recorded and it'll be available on YouTube immediately after this, but in an edited form shortly. So that is all from me. And thank you all, everyone. Thanks, Mark. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. So.